بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. The author rahimahullah begins his book by starting with the section of Babu Nawaqid al-Wudu by talking about the things that nullify wudu. At the beginning of his book, he starts with the word i'lam. In other words, he's saying know that, meaning know everything that I'm about to mention from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And the reason why he uses the order or the command i'lam, meaning to know, is because everything that he's going to mention in this book is what we call fard ayn. Fard ayn, meaning that everything that he mentions in this book is fard ayn, meaning that it is an individual obligation, meaning that it is an individual obligation on every sound Muslim, meaning every Muslim that is responsible according to the Sharia to act accordingly, which refers to anybody who has reached the age of purity and possesses sound intellect. So, since we are all mukallaf, then it is necessary that we know what is written in this book in order to carry out our acts of worship completely and soundly. So, that's why the author starts the book with i'lam. Then he makes a dua for the reader. And he says, وَافَقَكَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى, and may Allah give you tawfiq. And what we mean by the meaning of the word tawfiq when it's used, it means, when we say that Allah gives you tawfiq, it means that Allah has created for you the ability to worship Him. So that's what it means by tawfiq. May Allah give you the tawfiq. May Allah give you the ability to worship Him and be in obedience to Him. So the author is going to go on to start talking about the things that nullify wudu by separating them into two categories. We can generally separate the things that nullify wudu and the first thing that he mentions is ahdath. Al-ahdath are the things that nullify wudu directly, meaning that they are the primary cause for the nullifying of wudu. And then we have something called asbab al-ahdath, which we will mention later. So those things that he mentions that nullify wudu are 5. The first one that he mentions is al-madhi. Al-madhi means pre-ejaculation fluid, which is a thin, light fluid that comes out before ejaculation or anytime there is sexual arousal. When a male gets an erection, they will notice that there's a thin liquid that comes out. Same for a woman if she experiences sexual pleasure, not necessarily with sexual intercourse, she will release a thin fluid. All of this is called al-madhi, and this necessitates wudu. So, for example, if a person is having some type of sexual activity with their spouse, but not actually sexual intercourse, and they were to stop in the middle of it, in most cases they will find that either the woman has felt that she has released something which will cause some type of excrement of wetness, then that is what we mean by al-madhi. And for a man, when he has an ejaculation, he will feel a release of a thin white liquid that will be shown on the tip of his private part. This is what we consider al-madhi. Then we have al-wadiyu. Al-wadiyu is a thick, turbid, cloudy fluid, and in most cases for males I don't know if this occurs for females, but for males, it comes out in most cases after a person urinates. So sometimes a person may urinate and they'll find a thick cloudy fluid come out of their bodies. This is what we call al-wadiyu. Out of their private part, this is what we call al-wadiyu. Yani, for some people it will never happen. For some people it'll happen maybe once in a lifetime. For some people it will happen occasionally. This is what we call al-wadiyu. And then al-bawl, urinating. The third one is urinating, and urinating also nullifies wudu. So if any of these three liquids were to come out of the private part of a human being, then it would nullify wudu. These three that we mentioned come from the front end, and the next two that we're going to mention would come from the back end, which is passing gas and defecation. So defecating and passing gas are also things that break wudu directly. So what we mean by breaking wudu directly, meaning that the occurrence of these things are the primary causes for the nullification of a person's wudu. So these are what we call al-ahdath, meaning that they are occurrences. So what we mean by occurrences, meaning the coming out of these things from the specific private parts of the body, is what causes the nullification of wudu. Then we go on to mention two more. Then we go on to mention the asbab al-ahdath. What we mean by the asbab al-ahdath are the things, as you mentioned before, are the things that they don't necessarily break wudu directly, but they are in most cases causes for one of the 5 things that we mentioned to occur. So the first one that he mentions is sleep. For example, in most cases when a person falls to sleep, they are going to enter the state, or they're going to pass gas in most cases. In most cases when a person goes to sleep, in most cases they pass gas and they don't know it. So what we mean by al-asbab is that these things are not the primary causes, but in most cases they are reasons for one of the ahdath to occur. So the first one he mentions, as we mentioned, is naum, sleeping. And everybody must know that in our madhab we can separate sleeping into 4 different categories. And the reason why we're going to separate it into 4 different categories is to determine the different rulings that apply to it. So in fiqh, when we're separating things into categories, it's in order to either define things or to define the specific rulings that apply to them. To make it simple, we have such thing as heavy sleep and light sleep. So we have heavy sleep and light sleep. And when we say heavy sleep, we can define heavy sleep as the type of sleep that if a person were in it, he wouldn't feel or wouldn't be aware when somebody is walking past him back and forth. That's how some of the ulama define it. Some of the ulama define it as if a person is snoring. Some of the ulama define it as if somebody was to call him with a normal speaking voice and he didn't reply, that would be considered deep sleep. Others define it as if a person was in a state of sleep that if an object was to fall from his hand and it didn't wake him up, or he wasn't aware that he dropped it, then he's in a deep sleep, or he's in a heavy sleep. Yani thaqil means heavy sleep. So these are the different type of ways that you can tell whether a person is in a deep sleep or not. So the ruling of deep sleep, which we will cover first, we can split it into 2 categories as well. Deep sleep that is long and deep sleep that is short. In both cases, according to our school, as long as the sleeping is deep, it doesn't matter whether it's long or short. The rule will be the same, and the rule is that it's obligatory for them to make wudu. So as long as it's heavy or deep, doesn't matter if the sleep is long or short, it is obligatory for them to make wudu. Now we're going to move on to the other sleep, which we call qasir, which means short sleep. And short sleep is the opposite of heavy sleep. I mean, not short sleep, I should say light sleep, using the word khafif. Light sleep is the opposite of heavy sleep, meaning that if one of the things that we mentioned occurred and a person was to wake up, for example, if somebody was walking back and forth of a person who was sleeping, he was to wake up, or you were to call his name with a normal speaking voice and he was to wake up, or he dropped something out of his hand and he were to wake up, then that would be considered light sleep. If the light sleep is short, then his wudu will not be nullified. Although it is mustahab, although it's recommended or virtuous for him to make wudu, as long as wudu is light and it is short, his wudu will not be broken. But if it is light and it is long, then his wudu will be broken, because in most cases his intelligence or his awakeness will have been gone, even if it's only light sleep, because it's long. So if we were to check out these categories, we'd see that there's 4 scenarios. Under one scenario, it's not obligatory for him to make wudu, because his wudu will not be nullified, although it is mustahab for him to make wudu. Now the question will arise, how do we define the difference between long and short? According to the Malikiyah, we would go back to urf. According back to urf, we mean what we would generally call long are generally what we would call short. So if a person was sleeping to the point that a person would say you're sleeping for a long time, we would call it thiqi, we would call that long sleep. And if a person was to say, oh yeah, you're only sleeping for a couple minutes and you were napping, that would be considered short. So there's no actual time limit or duration for us to say long or to say short. So it goes back to customs. Then the author is going to move on to talk about some other things that nullify wudu, which come under asbab, which is called zawal al-aqli, the things which remove the awakenness of a person. So zawal al-aqli, we mentioned the first one is naum, sleeping, and then zawal al-aqli bil junoon, meaning a person who has been affected by a jinn, because their aql is gone. Although they're awake, it's as if they're sleeping, because they don't know what they're doing. So if a person was affected by a jinn, after that jinn were to be removed, then it would be it becomes obligatory for them to make wudu, because their wudu is nullified. Then wal ighma'u, fainting. If a person were to faint, then in that case it is also recommended, it is also obligatory for a person to make wudu. Was sukri, and drunkenness. If a person were to become drunk, and what do we mean by become drunk? Meaning a person who reaches the level of drunkenness to the point that he doesn't even know what he's saying, or he doesn't know the difference between fear and harm. For example, when a person gets drunk, when a person's not drunk, he wouldn't fight 1 or 2 people, but when he's drunk, if 10 men were to surround him, he would ask all of them if they want to fight. This person, although he's awake, it's as if he lost his state of awakeness, because his awareness of safety is absolutely gone. Or for example, a person who is just talking a bunch of nonsense, he doesn't really know what he's saying, he's just speaking, then this would be considered drunkenness, and a person in this case, after sobering, would be obligated to make wudu in order to pray. So these things nullify wudu because they are like sleeping. So but the ulama recognize that although they're like sleeping, in reality they are more severe than sleeping, because the person who sleeps, it usually only lasts for a short period of time, and it is easier for a person to wake up out of that state, whereas when a person's fainting, that's not the case. Or when a person's drunk, they don't snap out of that state easy. So a person who's sleeping, although he's sleeping, if you were to yell or you were to hit him, they would snap out of that state easier. But in terms of a person who's affected by a jinn, or who has fainted, or who is impaired, snapping out of that state is more difficult. So then he moves on to mention another thing which nullifies wudu, which is ridda. Ridda means coming out of Islam. So if a person leaves Islam, then according to the Malikiyyah, his wudu becomes nullified. Likewise, if a person was to come outside of Islam, then their hajj would also be nullified, and all of their former actions would become void, batil, nullified, which means that they would have to perform hajj again according to the Maliki school. Another thing in our school which nullifies wudu is shak fil hadath, having doubt about whether or not a person is in the state of wudu. In all the other schools, at least in the Hanafi school, if a person has doubt about his wudu, meaning does he have wudu or not, according to the Hanafis, then he would say that they would say that that the person still has wudu. In our school, Imam Malik took extra precautions, because in our madhab, praying with doubt means that your prayer would not be sound. So if a person, for example, were to pray, or for example, if a person he knows that he made wudu, for example, at Dhuhr a person made wudu, he prayed his Dhuhr prayer, then Asr time came in and he said to himself, I know I made wudu, but I think I broke it, or I'm not sure if I broke it or not, man. He shak means he's 50-50. Something's telling him that he did break it, something's telling him that he didn't break it. If he has shak, then in our madhab it's obligatory for him to make wudu. Then we have the other scenario, a person who's certain that he has nullified his wudu. He's certain, 100% certain that his wudu is nullified, but he has doubt, did I make it or not? For example, he's saying, I think I made wudu, but at the same time he has the same idea that he didn't make wudu. In this case, in the Maliki madhab, it's obligatory for him to make wudu. A third scenario, a person knows that he made wudu and he knows that he broke wudu, but he's not sure which one occurred first. For example, he's not sure which one occurred first. Did I break wudu before, or did I do one of the nullifiers before I made wudu, or did I do it after I made wudu? In this case, in this scenario as well, it is also obligatory for a person to for a person to make wudu, because his wudu will be nullified in this case. From the next thing that he's going to mention is the touching of the penis. Alright? So for a male to touch his own private part nullifies wudu, and we will talk later about the issue of a woman touching her private part. So as for a woman touching her private part, as for a male touching his private part, his wudu will be nullified, but there are conditions. The first condition is that private part has to be muttasil, meaning it has to be connected, meaning that if it wasn't connected to his body, it wouldn't nullify wudu. And when he touches it, it has to be touched with the inside palm of his hand. if he touches it with the inside palm of his hand, or the inside, whether it's the palm of the hand or the inside fingers, or the side of the fingers, then it will nullify wudu. So basically, if a person was to touch his private part with the inside palm of the hand, or the actual are the fingers, the inside palm of the fingers, or the side of the fingers, meaning he was to take his private part and put it between his two fingers, then this would nullify wudu. Contrary to that, let's say a person was washing his private part and didn't want to make his wudu, and so he turned his hand into a fist and he wiped it. This would nullify wudu because he did not touch it with the inside palm of his hand. So the conditions, again, in order for the wudu to be nullified for when a male is touching his private part, number one, that private part has to be connected to his body. And the reason why they say that is because for somebody to touch somebody else's private part doesn't nullify wudu. Right? So let's just say, for example, a Muslim doctor was doing some type of surgery on a male, and he was to touch his private part, that wouldn't nullify wudu. That's the breakdown of what it means that it has to be connected to his own body. And the second one is that it has to be touched with the palm of the hand, the inside palm of the hand, or the inside of the fingers, or the side of the fingers. So as long as all these conditions are here, then a person's wudu will be nullified. And I gave an example that of the contrary to it not being nullified would be to make a fist. Like a person was to make a fist and he was to touch and he wash his private part, then his wudu wouldn't be nullified because he did not touch it with the inside palm of his hand or the inside palm of his fingers. Now the ulama covered the question of what if a person has a sixth finger. Some people are born with a sixth finger. Does that nullify wudu? Yes or no? The ulama said that if a person has ihsas with that sixth finger, what do we mean by ihsas? Meaning that next finger has feeling. Meaning that if he were to move his other five fingers, he can move the other finger. Or basically this other finger, this extra finger operates like a finger. If it doesn't operate like a finger, then it's going to be considered a piece of skin, and that doesn't nullify wudu. So if that finger operates like another finger, meaning that it moves, that a person has the feeling of touch as they do on their fingers, then it will nullify wudu. Otherwise, it's just going to be considered a piece of skin, and it does not nullify wudu. Then we have touching. Touching in our school also breaks wudu. And what do we mean by touching? We mean touching the opposite sex. Touching the opposite sex nullifies wudu. But the touching of the opposite sex is touching somebody who in most cases ladha can be found. And what do they mean by that? Like a person who touches his wife, or touches a female that's not his mahram. But in terms of a female that's not his mahram, that is his mahram, like his mother and his sister, the rule doesn't apply. This rule of touching applies to the wife and a non-mahram. Because in most cases, this is where a person will find shahwa, will find sexual desire, if touching. So in our madhab, there's a basic principle which makes it easy. As long as if a person experiences either any type of sexual desire, and what do we mean by sexual desire? The fact that upon touching the person becomes inclined to that person. That is considered sexual desire. It doesn't mean that when a person touches a person, they have to they're thinking about sexual intercourse. It means that they have any type of physical inclination towards the opposite sex, whether in thought or in action. Then this would nullify a person's wudu, or the person intended to seek ladha. It doesn't matter if he found it or not. So for example, the person went and touched his wife or touched somebody of the opposite sex intending to seek desire. So whether he finds it or not, his intention is enough to nullify his wudu. So to clarify this, as long as a person finds ladha or he intends it, then his wudu will be nullified. Example of a person who felt ladha. For example, let's say a person was walking in a place that was packed with people, or he was in a store and a woman put money in his hand. He took the money and she touched part of his hand, or he touched part of her hand. He didn't intend ladha here. He didn't intend it, but he found it. Meaning found it, he experienced it. So as long as he experiences it, then regardless if he intended it or not, then his wudu will be nullified. Or let's say on the other hand, qasada ladha, meaning he intended ladha. For example, a person who reached out to touch a woman or shake the hand of a woman, but at the shaking of her hand, he didn't experience any ladha, right? Any desire. At this point, we say it doesn't matter, because the fact that he intended to is enough. So, in short, one of these two factors, as long as they're in the scenario, it nullifies wudu. And so, in general, we have 4 different type scenarios, meaning the first scenario would be in qasada ladha wa wajadaha, a person who intended ladha and he experienced it. That nullifies wudu. The second one would be in wajadaha wa lam yaqsidha, a person who experienced desire or sexual inclination, but he didn't intend it, but he found it. That nullifies his wudu. Or the opposite of that, a person who intended it, but he didn't find it, he didn't experience it, nullifies wudu. The last scenario would be a person who didn't intend it and didn't find it. So for example, a person who didn't intend it and didn't find it. Okay, an example of this would be, in our madhab, it is not permissible for the man to shake the hand of another female, or for a female to shake the hand of a male. But let's just say a person did, out of weakness. For example, the woman put out her hand to shake his hand, and so he shook it because he was afraid to go contrary to the general public that he's in, for argument's sake. In that case, he didn't seek ladha, nor did he find it. Meaning he didn't put his hand out in order to experience the softness of her hand, nor did he experience it upon doing it, because he knew what he was doing was wrong, and so he felt bad about it. In that case, his wudu is not nullified, because not one of these two, the experience nor the finding, not the experience nor the intention of it is present. Then this is the fourth scenario, and this doesn't nullify wudu. So now if we take a look at the text, I will give, actually when you look at the text now, the author is going to go on to talk about those things that do not nullify wudu. So we have some things that do not nullify wudu, and the reason why the author mentions them is because maybe they nullify wudu in another madhab, or there are some hadith that indicate that these things necessitate wudu, but the fuqaha did not practice these hadith for one reason or another. So the first one that he talks about is touching the anus. According to our madhab, touching the anus does not nullify wudu, whereas touching the front does. Also, touching the testicles doesn't nullify wudu as well. If a person were to, for example, wash his testicles, that doesn't nullify wudu, because the testicles and the penis technically are considered two different things. Also, it doesn't nullify, wudu is not nullified by touching the private parts of a young girl. For example, if a person, what do you mean by young girl? A girl before the age of bulugh. For example, before the age of puberty, or maybe even younger than that. For example, a person who is cleaning a young girl's diaper, for example, or a young girl's wound if he's a doctor, then in that case, that wouldn't nullify his wudu, because in most cases, a person doesn't find desire in touching young girls, a'udhu billah. So that doesn't nullify wudu. Also, vomiting in our madhab, where I think, contrary to the Hanafi school, vomiting doesn't nullify wudu as well. Also, eating camel meat doesn't nullify wudu, because there's a hadith that indicates that eating camel meat nullifies wudu, but the fuqaha of the Malikiyyah held that the meaning of that hadith was, what they meant by wudu here was the language, the linguistic meaning of wudu, which just means to wash your hands. And hijama, hijama and fast are pretty much doing the same thing, which means cupping. Doing cupping doesn't nullify wudu as well. If a person does cupping and blood comes out of his body, that doesn't nullify wudu as well. Also, he mentions that laughing in prayer, وَلَا بِقَهْقَهَةٍ فِي صَلَاةٍ, doesn't nullify prayer as well. Whereas in some madhabs it nullifies prayer, but in our madhab it doesn't nullify prayer. It doesn't nullify wudu. Although it nullifies prayer, it doesn't nullify wudu. And then he mentions وَلَا بِمَسِ إِمْرَأَةٍ فَرْجَهَا, and a woman touching her private part doesn't nullify wudu as well, according to the sound position. And he says وَقِيلَ إِنْ أَلْطَفَتْ فَعَلَيْهَا الْوُدُوء وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. Okay, the sound position in the Maliki school, contrary to what is intended in the text here, that touching the private part of a woman touching her private part does not nullify wudu. So if she was to take her hand and run it across her private part, that wouldn't nullify wudu. Although some ulama were of the opinion that if she was to stick her fingers on the inside, then that would nullify wudu. That's what he means, وَقِيلَ إِنْ أَلْطَفَتْ فَعَلَيْهَا الْوُدُوء وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. Yani, if she was to stick her finger on the inside and touch one of the sides of the inside, then that would nullify wudu, which is the opinion that is mentioned in Ibn Ashir. But in many of the major books, they say that the sound opinion is that under any circumstance, a woman touching her private part doesn't nullify wudu. So if a person wants to avoid the difference of opinion, then a woman, if she were to stick it on the inside, then it would be preferable for her to make wudu. Then that way she would be refrain from falling into doubtful matters. And so that is the end of the section on the things that nullify wudu. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.